Sam Grayson had never been much for appearances, and he certainly didn't care what people thought about the way he lived or what he drove. His house sat on the edge of Alder Ridge, a neighborhood that tried hard to brand itself as heritage modern, an architectural euphemism for overpriced stucco facades and ornamental lawns regulated down to the blade. Sam's place didn't match the vibe. The front porch sagged a little on one side, the shutters were sun-faded, and the driveway was cracked enough to make your teeth rattle if you weren't watching your step. And then there was the truck, an old, battered Freightliner with paint so faded it looked gray on sunny days and dark rust orange when it rained. Some said it was a leftover from a scrapyard. Others said it should have been put down like a dying horse years ago, but Sam knew every inch of it, every rattle and hum, and he maintained it like a surgeon would care for his instruments, methodically, religiously, and with an intimacy no one else understood. To him, it wasn't a relic. It was a tool, not just a means to haul things, but a working extension of his will, a machine that still did its job without complaint. It hadn't failed him once in the 15 years he'd owned it. When he first moved into Alder Ridge, the HOA was smaller, less aggressive, more interested in getting their communal sprinklers to work than micromanaging residents. But in the last 2 years, things had shifted. A new board was elected. New policies came in, ones with language that felt vaguely military in tone, all about compliance, appearance cohesion, and community standards. It wasn't long before they started sending notices about everything from mailbox color to the height of potted plants on the front steps. At first, Sam ignored them. The letters were impersonal and passive-aggressive, designed more to irritate than enforce. But after he skipped 2 community meetings in a row, he started noticing the tone changing. More direct, more pointed. There was something performative about it, like they were waiting for him to give them a reason to escalate. That reason came on a Tuesday evening, just as he was unloading salvaged equipment from a job site. He hadn't even turned off the engine when he saw the gathering at the end of his driveway. 5 people, all wearing the expression of polite outrage that only suburban power structures could generate. At the center was Brianna Hunt, president of the HOA and self-declared steward of neighborhood standards. She wore heels sharp enough to open envelopes and a blazer tailored like armor. In her hand, she held a folded packet of papers, which she flipped through with the theatricality of a stage actor. "We need to have a conversation," she said, not waiting for Sam to speak, "about that vehicle." Sam wiped the sweat from his brow with a rag and looked at her for a long second, then turned back to his truck and continued unloading. The silence that followed was thick. Brianna didn't like being ignored, and her voice sharpened as she continued. "There are rules about non-operational vehicles. That truck has been parked here for weeks. It's unsightly. Frankly, it drags down the entire street's aesthetic value. We've had complaints." Sam didn't look at her. "It runs." She laughed, sharp and brittle. "I find that hard to believe. You're welcome to ride in the back when I take it uphill." That drew a few chuckles from her entourage, quickly silenced when she gave them a cold glance. "We're issuing a notice. You have 48 hours to move it off the property, or we'll initiate the formal removal process. It's not personal, Mr. Grayson. But this is a neighborhood with expectations." Sam watched her for a moment, eyes unreadable, then said simply, "Then expect a reason." He walked inside without another word, the screen door groaning as it closed behind him. Behind him, the group hesitated, unsure whether they'd just won a battle or picked a fight they didn't understand. Sam hadn't slept well the night after his conversation with Brianna Hunt, but he wasn't restless from anxiety. If anything, he found the whole encounter too obvious to take seriously, like a game of chess where your opponent announces their move before even touching the piece. He wasn't someone who liked confrontation, but he also didn't avoid it when it came knocking. By the time he rose the next morning, the dew still glistened on the grass and a light mist curled between the rooftops like cigarette smoke. He made coffee, stood by the kitchen window overlooking the driveway, and saw the envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck. White paper. HOA logo in the corner. He didn't need to open it to know what it said, but he walked out barefoot anyway, took it in his hand, and read it while steam from his mug coiled upward. The letter was dense with legalese, references to Article 14, subsection 9b, terms like non-compliant property feature, unauthorized vehicle presence, and aesthetic violation. It concluded with a warning. The truck had to be removed within 48 hours, or the HOA would contact a third-party contractor to tow the vehicle at the homeowner's expense. There was no room for negotiation, no offer of conversation, just an edict, cold and administrative. Sam folded the letter and slid it into his back pocket. His face didn't change. He didn't mutter a curse or shake his head. Instead, he walked to the truck, opened the driver's side door, and climbed in. The cabin smelled of old vinyl and diesel, familiar and grounding. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a vibration that shook the mirrors. Not just running, thriving. He let it idle as he sat back sipping his coffee, letting the sound fill the morning air. Brianna's claim had been clear. The truck was an eyesore, assumed to be non-operational, abandoned even. But here it was, warm and loud, ready to haul a house if necessary. Still, he knew this wasn't about functionality. This wasn't about a vehicle parked too long in a driveway. This was about territory, about message sending, about reminding everyone who held the leash on neighborhood order. Later that afternoon, Sam received another letter. This one not from the HOA, but from a private logistics firm he had worked with in the past. It was a formal notice confirming that his truck had been reclassified under a renewed permit, effective immediately, for federal auxiliary support operations tied to emergency infrastructure testing. This wasn't unusual. Sam's vehicle, heavily modified over the years, had become something of a utility oddity. With its reinforced axles, extended chassis, and upgraded engine system, it had once been contracted during a winter emergency to haul backup generators across state lines when no one else could get through. It didn't make him rich, but it gave him access. Clearances, plates, and paperwork that meant, at the federal level, no one had authority to question its placement or use without tripping over red tape. He hadn't used the truck in months, but the permit gave him a legal shield, and just in time. That evening, he parked the truck half a foot closer to the curb, not to comply but to underline his awareness of their game. The next morning, the HOA didn't hesitate. By noon, a flatbed tow truck rumbled into the street. Bright orange, hired privately, operated by two men in reflective vests with clipped walkie-talkies and thick binders in their hands. One pointed at the truck while the other started toward Sam's driveway with a clipboard. Sam was already outside, sipping his coffee again, this time leaning against the hood like a man watching birds. When the worker approached and explained their task, removing the vehicle under HOA directive, Sam didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his back pocket, pulled out a laminated copy of the new federal authorization, and handed it over. The man read it. Then he read it again. Then he looked at Sam and said, "I'm going to need to call this in." The conversation between the two workers was hushed but animated. One of them started taking photos of the permit and sent them via text to someone higher up. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then the driver, clearly uncomfortable, walked back to Sam and said, "We're going to have to decline the pickup. This classification puts it outside our jurisdiction. We could lose our license touching it." Sam nodded. Understood. The truck revved once as the two men climbed back into their flatbed and reversed down the street. They didn't look back. Word traveled fast in places like Alder Ridge, though no one admitted to gossiping. That afternoon, Sam received no more letters, but he noticed something different. Neighbors who had always walked briskly past his house now slowed just slightly, eyes shifting toward the truck with curiosity or caution. Some avoided eye contact altogether, Others gave tight, polite nods. The HOA, however, was silent. No apology, no explanation, just quiet. But that quiet didn't last. 2 days later, Brianna Hunt returned, this time with 3 other board members in tow. She didn't knock on the door. She stood at the base of Sam's driveway and called out, "Mr. Grayson, we need to speak with you again." Sam stepped outside, still calm, still unreadable. Brianna gestured toward the truck. "We understand you've received some kind of exemption. However, this neighborhood still has rules about appearances. That thing, it doesn't belong here. It's a nuisance. It's legal," Sam interrupted, "protected, operational, and on my property." Brianna hesitated. "You're weaponizing bureaucracy to antagonize your community." Sam smiled for the first time in days. It wasn't warm. "You started the paperwork war. I just had thicker paper." Over the next week, the atmosphere around Sam's property changed in a way that couldn't quite be measured by any single event, but rather by the accumulation of subtle gestures and small, calibrated escalations. The HOA didn't send any more formal notices, but there were signals, little maneuvers that revealed how determined they were to reassert control without leaving fingerprints. The landscaping crew that normally trimmed the communal hedges began working conspicuously close to Sam's yard, cutting along his fence line even though that section was privately maintained. One morning, he found his mailbox left open, rainwater pooled inside, soaking through a stack of bills. The next day, his trash cans, always placed neatly at the curb, had been turned on their sides, lids removed, their contents scattered just enough to make it look like raccoons, but organized too specifically to be random. He never saw who did it, and the HOA would never admit to orchestrating anything, but the timing was too exact to ignore. They had found a new tactic: plausible deniability. Sam's response was as unflinching as it was restrained. He didn't file complaints. He didn't storm into the HOA office or send angry emails. Instead, he adjusted. He installed a new lock on his mailbox. He reinforced the hinges on his trash bins and bolted them to a weighted steel platform he'd welded himself. He even planted a row of low shrubs between the sidewalk and his driveway, an unspoken boundary, not ornamental, just deliberate. But the truck remained exactly where it had been, defiantly unaltered, silent, and still in the mornings, rumbling to life every few days when Sam ran the engine just long enough to remind everyone it wasn't going anywhere. What the HOA hadn't accounted for was how much attention their campaign would eventually draw, not from the outside world, but from within. Neighbors who once kept their distance began approaching Sam, not openly, but gradually, as if they were testing the water for how dangerous it might be to stand beside him. One man, whose name Sam didn't even know until then, stopped him on the sidewalk and said in a low voice, "I used to have an old RV parked in my backyard. They fined me for non-conforming storage structures. Took me 6 months to get it resolved." Another neighbor left a bag of produce from their garden at Sam's doorstep with no note, just a quiet gesture of solidarity. The seeds of quiet dissent had begun to sprout. But Brianna Hunt wasn't someone who tolerated resistance, even when it wore the mask of politeness. On a damp Thursday morning, Sam found something new waiting in front of his home. A thick, plastic-wrapped document envelope hung on his door handle with a heavy metal clip. Inside was a certified complaint, issued not by the HOA directly, but through a contracted legal liaison they retained for community dispute enforcement. It claimed Sam's vehicle was in violation of neighborhood safety standards. The basis: its presence supposedly restricted visibility for pedestrians and drivers entering the nearby intersection, and its dimensions posed an obstruction hazard. The document was clearly manufactured to imply urgency and authority, filled with intentionally vague language about municipal codes and pending fines. The last page included a veiled threat of towing under Emergency Compliance Authority, should the matter remain unresolved. This time, Sam didn't react immediately. He spent the rest of the day in his workshop, welding, grinding, and cutting without interruption. The next morning, just after sunrise, he rolled out a reinforced signpost he had fabricated himself and embedded it at the foot of his driveway. It was subtle in design, brushed metal bolted into concrete, but its message was unmistakable. Vehicle approved and classified for federal infrastructure utility under active permit. Tampering subject to federal review and penalty. The sign was legal, backed by documentation, and placed entirely within his property line. He didn't need it to be loud, he needed it to be visible. Within hours, HOA board members were pacing outside, staring at the sign from the sidewalk, whispering among themselves. Brianna wasn't with them that morning, but her shadow loomed large over their movements. That afternoon, an HOA-wide email went out under her signature, thinly veiled as a safety reminder, advising all residents to report any vehicle or object that might pose an obstruction or diminish the neighborhood's professional character. Though her message made no direct mention of Sam or his truck, the implication was so blatant it might as well have had his address in the subject line. And then, late one night, came the moment when it all shifted from nuisance to unmistakable hostility. Sam had been asleep only a few hours when a low metallic clank jolted him awake. Not loud enough to be an alarm, but just sharp enough to register as deliberate. He walked out onto his porch, barefoot, flashlight in hand. The truck was still there, seemingly untouched, but something felt off. He scanned the ground and spotted a cluster of small screws and bits of metal on the pavement beneath the chassis. Closer inspection revealed fresh tool marks around the bolts connecting the fuel tank cage. Someone had attempted to loosen the structure, maybe to vandalize, maybe to sabotage, maybe just to provoke. The job hadn't been finished, interrupted perhaps or botched by haste, but it was enough. Sam didn't call the police. He didn't need a report that would get quietly dismissed or delayed in a township where the HOA held social sway. Instead, he spent the next morning in silence, replacing every compromised part, installing protective housings, and securing the truck with tamper-resistant hardware that would take more than a wrench and good intentions to bypass. When the job was done, he sat on the porch with a cold bottle of water and watched the street with the stillness of a hunter waiting out a storm. He knew now, without doubt, that this wasn't about a vehicle anymore. It wasn't about aesthetics or bylaws or visibility. This was a campaign, a test, and someone had just failed to scare him off. It wasn't the sabotage attempt that changed Sam's posture. It was what he found the day after. Hidden beneath the truck, just past the rear axle and neatly affixed with industrial-grade adhesive, was a compact magnetic sensor the size of a matchbox. It hadn't been there before. Sam was sure of it. He checked his truck before every ignition, before every idle cycle, and before every routine maintenance sweep. Whatever this was, it had been installed recently, deliberately, and with a purpose not even remotely connected to neighborhood aesthetics. It wasn't a GPS tracker. Sam recognized that immediately. This was something else. Some kind of pressure or movement detector, likely meant to trigger a nearby relay or alert system. He removed it carefully with gloved hands, wrapped it in foil, and stored it inside an old lead-lined container he kept in the back of his workshop for handling sensitive electronics. Then he sat in the silence of the garage for a long time, thinking not about retaliation, but about escalation, because now the game had evolved. Whoever had planted the device wasn't just trying to remove a truck, they were monitoring him, studying behavior, waiting for a pattern. 2 days passed with no visible incident. The HOA remained outwardly quiet, but Sam could feel the tension in the air when he walked down the street. Side glances had turned into lingering stares, and neighbors he'd once considered passive bystanders now seemed divided into two distinct camps. Those who deliberately crossed the street when they saw him, and those who looked away too quickly, as if afraid to be caught acknowledging him. But the silence didn't last. On the third morning, Sam received an official summons, not from the HOA, but from a municipal review board. The letter, printed on heavy stock paper and hand-delivered, outlined a formal hearing scheduled for the following week. The subject, a complaint filed by the Alder Ridge HOA concerning a resident's non-compliance with vehicular zoning provisions related to emergency accessibility. It cited 3 articles from a recently updated town ordinance, a footnote referencing an obscure emergency use exemption clause, and a demand for a temporary removal order until the matter could be adjudicated. The language was cunning, drafted, no doubt, by someone with just enough legal fluency to camouflage their intent in a forest of bureaucratic phrasing. But Sam knew what it meant. They couldn't beat him through the HOA's internal system, so they had taken the battle outside, leveraging city infrastructure in hopes of bypassing the protections he'd built. Sam didn't attend the hearing alone. He brought 2 binders, one filled with permit records, correspondence logs, and documentation of every federal contract his truck had ever fulfilled. The other filled with copies of every letter, every notice, every threat he had received from the HOA since the beginning. The board members listened in silence as he laid out the timeline, never raising his voice, never veering off point. He didn't accuse. He didn't insult. He simply presented facts with the precision of someone who had long since stopped caring about social politics and focused solely on the truth. When the board asked him whether the truck was currently in active use under government contract, he handed over a signed affidavit from the agency confirming its designation as a utility vehicle under federal mobilization protocols. Subject 2. Immediate deployment on short notice. It was, legally, the equivalent of trying to tow a fire engine. They adjourned after an hour, clearly unprepared for the thoroughness of his defense. 3 days later, Sam received the decision by mail. The complaint had been dismissed. The town board cited lack of jurisdiction and confirmed that the vehicle, as registered, fell under exemption status pending further federal directives. No fines, no temporary removal, no appeal. The HOA had failed, but Sam didn't celebrate. He knew better than to think the loss would make them retreat. If anything, it would only fuel their resentment. And he was right. That same week, Brianna Hunt requested an emergency advisory meeting for all HOA residents. The email was worded vaguely, hinting at growing concerns about neighborhood cohesion and the need for collective dialogue around issues of public safety and visual standards. Sam didn't attend. He had no interest in listening to a public performance disguised as community consensus. But several neighbors who did attend later reached out in private, some with concern, others with disbelief. Brianna had used the meeting to unveil a proposal for a new neighborhood charter amendment, one that would give the HOA expanded powers to enforce aesthetic compliance across all visible properties, including driveways and parked vehicles, regardless of ownership classification. It was a bold move, requiring 2/3 majority approval by vote, and she framed it as necessary for the preservation of real estate value and community dignity. During her speech, she reportedly referred to certain individuals who had exploited regulatory loopholes to undermine the harmony of the neighborhood. She never said Sam's name, but no one needed her to. It was then that Sam made his only public move since the beginning of the conflict. He left a single-page letter at the community bulletin board outside the HOA office, folded into a plastic sleeve and pinned with industrial staples so no one could remove it easily. It contained no argument, no defense, no threats, just a list. 4 bullet points. The first, the legal classification of his truck under federal code. The second, a record of the dismissed municipal complaint. The third, a note that any tampering with the vehicle could be prosecuted under federal interference statutes. And the fourth, monitoring devices found on private property will be assumed hostile and treated accordingly. No signature, just initials, SG, in one corner. That letter wasn't mentioned in any official HOA communication, but within a day, someone had removed the magnetic sensor from the bulletin board where Sam had pinned it next to the text. No one spoke of it. No one asked questions, but people noticed. And in places like Alder Ridge, perception always traveled faster than truth. Brianna Hunt was many things. A planner, a strategist, a woman who understood that real control was less about volume and more about structure. She knew when she was losing momentum, and after the failed municipal complaint and the quiet fallout from her amendment proposal, she understood the tide was shifting, even if the vote hadn't yet taken place. But retreat was not in her nature. Instead, she pivoted. If legal mechanisms had failed and public persuasion had faltered, then the next phase had to be quieter, narrower in focus, and targeted. And so, a new campaign began. Not against Sam directly this time, but against the foundation he stood on, his perceived legitimacy, his social neutrality, and the illusion that his silence equaled safety. It started with minor adjustments to the HOA newsletter. An entire column titled "Understanding Zoning Abuse" appeared, written under the byline of a community contributor, but unmistakably in Brianna's cadence. The article framed vague scenarios: residents using false classifications to store industrial equipment, unreported structural additions disguised as routine repairs, and the danger of community apathy in the face of such violations. Names weren't used, of course, but the descriptions were unmistakably pointed. A vehicle occupying a driveway with suspicious frequency, a neighbor known for avoiding communication while exhibiting increasingly erratic territorial behavior, and concerns about machinery potentially containing non-compliant fuel systems. By the end of the piece, even residents who had quietly sympathized with Sam found themselves questioning what exactly he was doing behind the closed doors of that workshop, and whether silence always equaled innocence. Then came the unannounced visits. Not from law enforcement or contractors this time, but from surveyors, employed by a property standards firm supposedly conducting a routine audit of land use compliance across the region. Sam observed them from a distance as they paced up and down the street, dressed in utility vests with clipboards in hand, occasionally stopping to snap photos or jot notes near driveways, mailboxes, and storm drains. One of them paused a little too long in front of Sam's property line, pointing at something on the ground with the tip of a boot, before lifting a small camera and taking a picture of the side of Sam's garage. When Sam stepped outside and walked slowly toward them, they quickly dispersed with manufactured politeness, offering no clear explanation and refusing to identify who had commissioned the audit. The next day, Sam checked with the county registrar and confirmed what he suspected. No regional land use survey was currently in progress, which meant this was, at best, a private data collection initiative and, at worst, coordinated surveillance under the guise of regulatory diligence. Sam began reinforcing the perimeter of his home, not dramatically, but with deliberate method. Wireless blind spot sensors, weatherproof recorders, and perimeter motion alarms. Not because he was afraid, but because he recognized the shift in tactics. They had stopped trying to beat him by rules. Now they were trying to wear him down by ambiguity, by creating an atmosphere where everything he did felt observed, dissected, and stored for future use. But the final move in this phase came not from Brianna or any of her known affiliates, but from a board member named Elliot Dunn. Previously quiet, nominally neutral, and generally perceived as the voice of reason within the HOA. He requested a one-on-one meeting with Sam, citing a need for de-escalation and transparency. Sam agreed cautiously. They met on neutral ground, a quiet public park near the edge of the neighborhood, late in the evening when the playgrounds were empty and the grass still wet with residual sprinkler mist. Elliot arrived with no paperwork, no phone out, just his hands tucked into the pockets of a windbreaker. He didn't posture. He didn't lecture. Instead, he asked questions. Not about the truck or the garage, but about why Sam had chosen to stay through everything. Why not just move? Why continue pushing back when it would be easier to disappear, sell, and start over elsewhere? Sam listened without interrupting, then answered in a tone that was neither angry nor impassioned. He spoke about ownership, not of property, but of ground, hard-earned, of autonomy earned through years of labor, of a quiet life that asked nothing from anyone but demanded the right to exist on its own terms. And then, without changing his tone, Sam asked Elliot if he knew about the sensor found under the truck. Elliot blinked, hesitated, then said no. Sam asked if Elliot had heard about the fake surveyors. Again, no. Sam asked if he believed that silence was the same as neutrality. Elliot didn't respond. 2 days later, Sam found a message taped discreetly to the side of his mailbox. Unsigned, folded in half, and protected from the wind by a strip of weatherproof tape. Inside was a single line handwritten in clean block letters. "You're not paranoid." They've just stopped hiding. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It was confirmation from someone inside, or at least close enough to know the internal tone had changed. And with that, the escalation entered a new phase. Sam didn't change his routine. He didn't increase his defenses or alter his behavior. He simply logged the moment, burned the note in a steel canister behind his garage, and went back to work. Because now it was no longer about convincing others or defending his space. Now it was about endurance. The breaking point arrived not with another letter, not with a staged complaint or some vague threat, but with a sound that could not be ignored. It was late afternoon. Heavy gray clouds pressing low over Alder Ridge, and the air smelled of iron and wet asphalt as the storm built above the rooftops. Sam was in his workshop tightening a series of bolts on a hydraulic rig when the noise cut through the rain. The sharp, unmistakable screech of tires and the hollow thud of metal against curb. He stepped outside and immediately saw the scene unfolding at the intersection 2 houses down. A sleek black BMW, gleaming despite the rain, sat half on the curb and half in the street, smoke curling from under its hood. The front axle looked snapped, the right wheel bent in at an unnatural angle, steam hissing as rain hit the hot surface. And there, standing in the storm in her immaculate blazer now soaked through, was Brianna Hunt, shouting into her phone with the controlled panic of someone who believed authority should have been enough to protect her from accident. Traffic backed up quickly, neighbors gathered under umbrellas, and someone called for a tow truck, though the nearest contractor estimated a 45-minute wait at minimum given the weather. Sam didn't rush. He didn't speak. He walked calmly back to his driveway, climbed into the cab of his truck, and turned the key. The old Freightliner roared alive, a low growl rising above the thunder. Every head turned. He eased the beast forward, headlights piercing the gray, and rolled slowly toward the scene. By the time he stopped near the BMW, the murmurs had already begun. First surprise, then realization, and finally silence. Brianna looked up from her phone, fury and embarrassment fighting for dominance across her face. She opened her mouth, but Sam didn't wait for her to speak. He climbed down, rain plastering his shirt to his shoulders, and walked to the rear of his truck where he pulled free a tow rig he had modified years ago. It wasn't pretty, but it was efficient. Chains reinforced, hooks calibrated for vehicles far heavier than the BMW gasping on the curb. He worked without commentary, his movements practiced and deliberate, each clang of metal against metal punctuated by the thunder above. When Brianna finally found her voice, it cracked sharper than intended. "This isn't necessary. I already called." But Sam interrupted without looking at her, his tone flat and quiet enough that only those closest could hear. "You'll be waiting an hour, maybe more. Or you can let me move it now." He clipped the rig in place, adjusted the tension, and within minutes the BMW was lifted free, its bent wheels suspended uselessly in the air. Gasps broke from the crowd, not because of the act itself, but because of the realization dawning on them. that the same truck Brianna had mocked, the same vehicle the HOA had tried to erase, was the one hauling her luxury car out of disaster under federal clearance. As the rig secured, a black SUV pulled up with government plates. A man in a raincoat stepped out, showed his credentials to a police officer who had just arrived, and nodded toward Sam's truck. "Authorized equipment," he said simply, his words carrying enough weight to silence the murmur of the onlookers. "Proceed." That was all. No drama, no spectacle. Just confirmation, delivered with the authority Brianna had once believed she alone wielded in this neighborhood. Sam climbed back into the cab, adjusted the gears, and slowly pulled the BMW down the street with the kind of power that made the ground tremble underfoot. Neighbors followed at a distance, umbrellas bobbing, whispers rising like steam. By the time he reached his driveway and unhooked the car, the storm had begun to break, sunlight bleeding faintly through the clouds as if the entire scene had been orchestrated for effect. He parked the BMW neatly at the curb, released the chains, and stepped back without ceremony. Brianna stood several yards away, her hair plastered to her forehead, her phone limp in her hand, her expression caught between disbelief and the kind of humiliation that has no language strong enough to disguise it. Sam didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply said, "Now you know why it stays," and walked back into his workshop, leaving the engine of his truck idling like a beast too old to die, too stubborn to be silenced, and too necessary to be dismissed. In the days that followed the storm, the neighborhood of Alder Ridge seemed to recalibrate itself in small, almost imperceptible ways, as if the incident with the BMW had knocked something loose from its carefully maintained order. The HOA remained outwardly functional, but beneath the surface the board fractured. Meetings grew tense, votes failed to pass, and Brianna's grip slipped with each attempt to regain control. Some residents stopped answering her emails altogether, others voiced cautious dissent during gatherings, and more than a few began avoiding her entirely when passing on the street. The humiliation of watching her own car dragged away by the truck she had condemned was not just a personal embarrassment, but a public undoing, and no amount of rhetoric could wash the image from memory. For Sam, nothing outwardly changed. The truck remained in his driveway, the sign at its base still bolted into concrete, and his days unfolded in the same quiet rhythm as before. Long hours in the workshop, evenings on the porch, the occasional drive out when work or necessity demanded. Yet, there was a difference in the way people looked at him. Neighbors who once crossed the street now offered brief nods, small acknowledgments that carried no words but held weight nonetheless. A few even approached him directly, asking for advice on repairs, or quietly thanking him for stepping in when no one else could. Sam didn't linger in conversation, but he didn't turn them away either. He accepted their words with the same calm detachment he gave to everything, never boasting, never reminding them of what had passed. Eventually, Brianna resigned. The announcement was clipped and formal, citing personal reasons and the need to focus on family commitments. But everyone understood what it meant. A new president was elected, one far less concerned with rigid appearances and far more willing to listen. Policies were reviewed, priorities reshaped, and the most aggressive language in the charter quietly disappeared. The neighborhood softened. Sam, however, didn't seek a seat on the board or a formal role in the restructured order. He declined politely when asked, insisting he had no interest in governance. His place, he said, was exactly where it had always been. Behind the wheel of his truck, in his garage on his porch with the evening light catching the weathered paint of a machine too often misunderstood. To the community, he became something different than a pariah or an obstacle. He became a reminder that appearances could lie, that silence could hold strength, and that sometimes the most reliable thing on a pristine street was the rusted old truck nobody wanted until it was the only thing that could save them.